Okay, so in this quick video, we are going to see how you can register sites and document libraries that have been created outside of Intapp in the Intapp Documents Platform, and it's done using the API. So it's a two-step process. What we do is we use the API to create a registration for the item, first of all, within the Intapp Documents Platform. And then once you've done that, then it's a second API call, which then updates the created item with the URL of the SharePoint site or library that's been created outside of Intapp. So how do we do this? Well, if you're an administrator and you're in the Intapp platform, simply go to Settings, go to Setup, go to Reference, and then click here to view the API. And what that will do is take you to the Swagger UI for the Intapp interface or Repstor custodian interface. Now, the first API method we want to run is called create. Okay, create item. It appears under this create section of the Swagger interface. Expand the create item option here and scroll down slightly, and you'll see there's an option to actually run this API request from the Swagger interface. So the useful thing here is there's a little yellow box on the right hand side here, which gives you an example value, and that example value can be used to fill in your API request. Okay, so clicking on it will pre-fill the request box on the left hand side. So what we do now is we just update the request with our relevant parameters. So the type in this case, what am I creating here? So it's of type, let's just check. So I want to create actually a function, okay? So what we do is go back to the Swagger API and replace type, the string there, with function. We give the object a title. So in this case, I want to create a function called finance for the sake of argument. We then need to specify the template ID, okay? And this isn't immediately obvious how you find this. So let's go back to the Intapp platform here for a second and find out how we find the template ID. So you go in as an administrator, you click on templates. You find the relevant template that this relates to. So in this case, I want to register this thing. It's going to be a site collection. So there's my site collection template or whatever template you want to use. Click on edit on the right hand side. And then in the address bar, you will see in the URL, there's actually a big long GUID. So in this case, 7, etc., right up as far as the question mark. So everything between the edit slash and this question mark is actually the ID of this template that you need. So let's just copy that, go back to our Swagger interface and paste that template ID in. Now, the next two properties we don't actually need. So the parent ID, well, this is a root object, so there is no parent in this case. The form button is kind of redundant, so we can just delete those. They're not relevant to the request. The final thing that we need to provide is the SP host URL, which is the URL of the site on which Intapp Documents has been installed, the host site. So how do we find that? Well, if you just go back to the platform itself, you can click on the SharePoint icon at the top right, and it takes you to the site, the SharePoint site that's actually hosting Intapp. So simply copy that URL. Let's go back to Swagger, paste the URL in, and we're almost ready. Well, we are ready now to actually try out this API request. So we've constructed our API request. We've provided the type, the title, the template ID, and the host site of the URL. Click on try it out. And what that will do is submit that request to Intapp for registration of that object. And you can see there it's been submitted, it's completed, and it's important to check here that you get a response code of 200. That indicates that the action has been successful, which is great. Okay. Just to validate that, if we now go back to Intapp, let's just go back here. Let's check our functions list now. Click on all functions. And there you go. You can see within the last few moments, this finance function has just been created. Now we've registered the object in Intapp, which is great. What we need to do now is a secondary step, which is to update this newly created object with the URL that the finance site actually exists at. So how do we do that? Well, again, it's done via the API. It's actually pretty simple. Before we do, just take a note of the code that's been allocated to this this new function that we've just created. So in this case, it's 00002. Let's go back to our Swagger API, and this time scroll down to the re-provision section of the API. Re-provision, it's actually all to do with updating metadata, updating the provisioned objects, and so on. So there's a series of methods that are available here. The one that we want to use is this one called update metadata by code. Okay, so we click on update metadata by code, and as before, we have an example value here on the right hand side, which if we click on it, will pre-populate our request here on the left hand side. Let's just expand that. A lot of this stuff is redundant, okay, so we can delete it, but let's just work through. First of all, the code that we want to update. We want to update the function method, the finance function, which had a code of 00002. The type, as we know, is function. Cascade to content isn't directly relevant here, nor is this synchronous parameter, so we're just going to delete those. The metadata that we want to update, this is very important, okay? So we need to specify, first of all, it's essentially a name value pair. So the name of the property that we want to update, it's very specific. It's called server relative URL, okay? It's a server relative URL, and that is essentially the name of the property that we're updating behind the scenes. And then the value that we need to specify is, you've guessed it, it's the server relative URL of the SharePoint site or library, well in this case it's a site collection, that we want to register. Now, for the purposes of this little session, I'm actually just going to register this site as the URL of this new function, okay? So we just paste that URL in, pretty simple. This connected list metadata is not relevant, so we can actually delete that entire section, okay? Get rid of it. And then the final thing we need to do is just put in the SP host URL, okay? So that's the URL of where our custodian site is, which is actually just the site that we're using at the moment. This obviously isn't a production system. This isn't how you would structure this in reality, but this suffices for demo purposes. So we've constructed our request once again, and what we're doing is we are updating our newly created function number 2, which was the finance function we created a few moments ago. And we are telling Intapp to update the server relative URL property of that created function with this value, okay? Once we've done that, simply click on try it out as before. That will submit that request to the Intapp APIs, okay? As before, make sure you get a response code of 200, and that's great. That means that's been submitted successfully. What that means now is if we go back to our Intapp UI, let's just refresh the screen here. What that means here is that this finance item, which we created through the API and which we updated with a URL using the second API method, is now valid. And if we click on this finance link here, perfect. That's now taken us to the relevant site collection which was referenced. And if this was a finance site or a HR site or whatever it might have been created outside of Intapp, we would now be able to navigate through to that. And of course, because it's now registered within Intapp, we can pin it into the Intapp Documents Client and so on. One final thing to mention just before we go any further is what happens if we want to create a child object. Okay, so let's say now we've created a function called finance, and within my functions I can have activities. Okay, if I want to create an activity, how do I do that? Okay, well, very similar process. We go back to the Swagger API, and let me just refresh or reload the page just to reset things a little bit here. We're going to use the create API once again. We're going to use the create item API. We are going to pre-fill our request on the left hand side with the example value, and we're going to fill in the details of the request. So in this case, the type of object that I'm creating is going to be an activity. This time the title of my activity, so it might be the accounts for 2023, for example. We need to specify the template ID. So how do we do that? Well, as before, we go to templates in Intapp Documents. This time it's a different template that I'm referencing here. It's a document library template. So again, I just edit the template, find the ID of the template, copy it, back to Swagger, paste the template ID in, and this is the key difference. This time we need to specify a parent ID. Okay, so we're creating this under the parent ID of finance, whose code is 00002. So let's just put that in. Quote 00002, which is the code of my finance function. The form button is irrelevant. Let's get rid of it. And final thing, of course, is our SP host URL. So let's just copy that as before and paste that in. Our request has now been constructed. This time we're creating a child object, an activity object with a title of accounts for 2023. We're using the appropriate template ID, and this is the key difference. This is where we're telling it, hey, this is a child object. You need to be created under the parent with this code of 00002. So let's go ahead and try it out. Click on that try it out button. That will submit the request to Intapp. As before, if we scroll down, we've got a response code of 200. That's great. Let's now go back to our Intapp platform. Let's now take a look at our activities. Take a look at all of our activities. And hey presto, you can now see we have a new activity created called Accounts for 2023. And you can see it itself has a code of 0002, and its function, its parent function, is in this case finance. So we've registered that new activity and we've associated it with a parent object. The final thing, of course, to do is then to run the API request to update the metadata for this accounts for 2023 item with the URL of where that library actually exists. So I'll not do that as part of this video because it's effectively an exact repeat of what we did earlier. So that's a quick run through of the steps to register functions, activities. This could be clients, could be matters, could be customers and engagements, whatever your entities are within Intapp. You can use the process described in this video to essentially register objects that were created outside of Intapp into the Intapp platform. Hopefully you found this video useful. If there are any questions, just feel free to reach out and contact me.